The machine gun opened fire at 4 in the afternoon. Felix Sparks heard it from 40 yards away. He had just left the coal yard, just placed the SS prisoners against the wall, posted a guard, turned his back, and walked toward the center of the camp, where 30,000 half-dead human beings were pressing against the wire, screaming in a dozen languages, reaching through the gaps with skeletal hands. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. Then the gun opened up. Not the sound of a firefight. Not the back and forth of men shooting at each other in the dark. A single weapon, firing in short, controlled bursts. The sound of something being done deliberately. Sparks turned and ran. He came around the corner of the L-shaped wall at a dead sprint and stopped. Private William Curtin was 19 years old. He was behind the machine gun. He was crying. His face was wet, and his shoulders were shaking, and his finger was still on the trigger, and he was still firing, even as he cried, into the line of men along the back wall. 12 Germans were already down. Some were not moving. Others were. One had his hands still raised, the same hands that had been raised for the past 2 hours, and he was looking at the sky, as though something up there might explain what was happening to him. The other soldiers stood and watched. Nobody moved to stop it. Nobody raised a voice. Sparks pulled his .45 from its holster. He did not aim it at the Germans. He aimed it at his own men. "Anyone fires another round," he said, "I will shoot them myself." His voice did not shake. He had made his voice stop shaking a long time ago, somewhere in Sicily or at Anzio, or in one of the 20 other places where he had learned that the only thing standing between order and catastrophe was a man willing to mean what he said. He looked at them one by one. These were not strangers. These were the men he had led for 500 days across 2 continents. He knew their names. He knew which ones kept photographs of their mothers in their breast pockets, and which ones pretended they didn't. He knew who had screamed in their sleep at Anzio, and who had gone quiet after Anzio, which was worse. He had carried 2 of them off a field under fire and been told, afterward, that he would be arrested for disobeying orders, and had not cared. He looked at them now, and he saw something in their faces that he did not have a word for. It was not hatred. Hatred he understood. Hatred was clean. Hatred was something you could identify and address, and, if necessary, shoot your way through. This was something else. Something that had been building since they crossed the main gate of Dachau an hour ago, and found a world that none of their training, none of their experience, none of their accumulated understanding of what human beings were capable of doing to one another had prepared them for. The gun went silent. Curtin's hand dropped from the trigger. He was still crying. Sparks looked at the men on the ground. He looked at his soldiers. He looked at the men on the ground again. In 20 years of trying to remember this moment, he would never be able to say what he felt standing there. He had told the story a handful of times, in depositions and in interviews, and in a personal account he wrote for the men of the 157th Infantry long after the war was over. He described what he saw. He described what he did. He described the orders he gave and the investigation that followed, and the day he walked into Patton's office and watched a general tear apart a stack of papers and throw them in a wastebasket. What he never described, what he never found the language for, was the 3 seconds between hearing the gun open fire and reaching for his holster. 3 seconds where he understood exactly what was happening. 3 seconds where he could see the coal yard in his mind and know what he would find. 3 seconds where Felix Sparks, who had crossed a beach under fire, who had survived Anzio when everyone around him died, who had dragged wounded men through machine gun fire with his bare hands, did not know what he was going to do when he got there. He had spent the better part of an hour inside Dachau by that point. He had seen the rail cars before he even reached the gate, 39 of them, parked on the tracks outside the complex, filled with 2,000 bodies stacked like timber. He had smelled them from 100 yards away, not the smell of a battlefield, which he knew, as well as he knew his own name. Something older, something that had been accumulating for 12 years, while the world looked elsewhere. He had walked through the barracks. He had seen the medical experimentation rooms. He had seen the crematoria and the gas chamber and the punishment cells and the warehouses where the clothing of the dead had been folded and sorted and stacked with a neatness that was somehow more disturbing than the rest of it, the neatness of a system, of a process, of human beings organized around the business of destroying other human beings, as efficiently as possible. He had seen his own soldiers, combat veterans, men who had watched their friends die in ways that do not appear in any history book, stop walking and stand in the middle of the road and simply stare. One man vomited against the wall of a barracks and then straightened up and kept moving because there was nothing else to do. Another sat down in the dirt and put his head in his hands, and when Sparks came to him and told him to get up, the man looked at him with an expression that was not defiance or exhaustion, but something closer to genuine incomprehension, as though the categories he had been using to make sense of the world had just stopped working. And now Sparks was standing in the coal yard with a pistol in his hand, 12 men down on the ground, his own soldiers watching him. The question that would follow him for the next 62 years, the one he never answered publicly, the one that surfaced in quiet rooms long after the war and the investigations and the career and all the accumulated noise of a long life had settled, was not the question the Army asked. The Army asked, who gave the order? Who pulled the trigger first? Was this a war crime or a response to provocation? Those questions had answers. The investigation would find them, or most of them, and Colonel Decker would write his conclusions, and the papers would go into the archive, and eventually, in 1987, someone would open a filing cabinet in Washington, and the world would finally see what had been sealed away. The question Felix Sparks carried was different. It was simpler. If he had been 30 seconds slower, if he had been on the other side of that wall when Curtin's finger found the trigger, would he have run toward the sound of the gun? Or would he have stopped and waited and let it finish? He never said. And the fact that he never said, in 62 years of a life that included depositions and interviews and a personal account written for the historical record, tells you something about a man who was not, by any account, afraid of difficult truths. Before this story goes any further, if this is the first time you've found WW2 Untold Vault, subscribe now. We tell the stories of World War II that textbooks don't have room for, the real human moments on both sides of the wire. Now, back to April 29, 1945, and the man who was there before the coal yard, before the investigation, before Patton's office, a man from a copper mining town in Arizona who had spent his whole life learning, through poverty and war and loss, what it cost to do the right thing, and who was about to learn it one more time. Felix Sparks did not grow up believing he would amount to anything in particular. That was not self-pity. It was geography. Miami, Arizona, in the 1920s was a copper mining town built around a single industry and a single assumption that the men who lived there would work the mine and their sons would work the mine after them, and the town would go on that way until the copper ran out or the company decided it had taken everything worth taking and moved on. Felix's father worked for the company. The family had 5 children and enough to get by until 1931, when the Great Depression arrived in Miami the way it arrived in 1,000 towns like it, without warning and without apology. The mine shut down. Felix was 14. He remembered standing in the food lines with his mother. The particular quality of that silence, not the silence of a library or a church, but the silence of people who have nothing left to argue about, who are waiting for something they cannot speed up or change, who have learned that dignity and hunger can coexist if you stand straight enough. His mother always stood straight. He learned that from her before he learned anything else. He finished high school in 1935 and left home the day after graduation, not because anyone told him to, because there were 5 children and his father had no work, and one fewer mouth was one fewer mouth. He said goodbye on the front porch. His mother did not cry. He did not look back at the end of the road, because he knew, if he did, he would not keep walking. He spent months drifting. Corpus Christi, San Francisco. Odd jobs that ran out. Savings that ran out faster. By the time he reached the Bay Area, he was sleeping, where he could find space, and eating when something presented itself. And the city, that was supposed to be the end of the road, was offering him nothing except the view. He enlisted in the Army because it was the only door that was open. He was 18 years old. He did not enlist out of patriotism or ambition or any of the reasons that look clean in retrospect. He enlisted because the Army would feed him and give him a place to sleep and ask nothing in return except that he follow orders and stay alive. two things he had already been practicing his entire life. What the Army did not anticipate was Felix Sparks. His commanding officers, over the years, would use a consistent vocabulary to describe him: stubborn, insubordinate, difficult. One of them, exasperated beyond professional language, assigned him to lead a company of the division's most notorious troublemakers as a form of punishment. Sparks took the assignment and turned the company into one of the best-performing units in the regiment, which did not endear him to the officer who gave him the posting. He had a particular quality that the Army valued in combat and tolerated badly everywhere else. He could not be made to do something he believed was wrong. Not through rank, not through threat. When he was wounded by shrapnel in Italy, and the doctors in North Africa examined him and told him he was unfit for duty and would not be returning to the front, he waited until the right moment, walked to the airfield, climbed onto a transport bound for Italy, and flew back to his men. He was running for military police when he rejoined the 157th. He was informed he would be arrested as soon as he returned from the next engagement. He went to the next engagement anyway. "My men were dying," he said afterward, with the particular brevity of a man who considered that explanation complete. By April 1945, Felix Sparks was 27 years old and had been in continuous combat for more than 500 days. He had landed in Sicily in July 1943. He had fought up the boot of Italy through some of the ugliest terrain and weather the European theater had to offer. He had been at Anzio, a name that meant something specific and terrible to anyone who had been there, where the German counterattack in February 1944 had fallen directly on his position, and when it was over, of the men who had been beside him, only Sparks and one other soldier were still standing. He did not talk about Anzio. What the 500 days had given him, beyond the medals and the scars and the battlefield promotions, from lieutenant to major to lieutenant colonel, was a precise and unsentimental understanding of what men were capable of, both the best and the worst of it. He had seen men perform acts of courage, so complete that no language he knew could carry the full weight of them. He had seen men break in ways they never recovered from. He had learned, through repetition and loss, that the line between those two outcomes was thinner than anyone wanted to believe, and that the primary job of a commanding officer was not strategy or tactics but the maintenance of that line, keeping men on the right side of it, in conditions specifically designed to push them over. He was good at that job. He had been doing it for 500 days. He did not know, on the morning of April 29, 1945, that Dachau existed. The man standing on the other side of that day was named Heinrich Wicker. He was an Untersturmführer, a second lieutenant in the SS, and on the morning of April 29, he was the highest-ranking German officer remaining at the Dachau concentration camp. The men above him had been leaving for days. Camp Commandant Martin Weiss had gone. The senior guards had gone. The officers who had run the machinery of the place for years, who had designed the schedules and signed the orders and overseen the processes that had consumed more than 41,000 lives since 1933, had packed what they needed and disappeared into the collapsing Reich, leaving behind the camp, the prisoners, and Heinrich Wicker. He was 25 years old. He had not been at Dachau long. He had arrived in the final months of the war, assigned to a posting that his superiors had already decided was temporary, a way station on the road to either surrender or flight, depending on how things developed. He was not among the architects of what had happened in that place. He was among those who had been handed the keys to a ruin and told to hold it until further notice. Further notice never came. On the morning of April 29th, Wicker made a decision that his predecessors had refused to make. He did not run. He did not order the remaining guards to fight to the last. He gathered what was left of the SS garrison, obtained a white flag, and went to the gate. When Brigadier General Henning Linden arrived at the camp's entrance, with soldiers from the 42nd Infantry Division, Wicker was waiting. There were journalists present. There was a Belgian correspondent and an American war correspondent named Marguerite Higgins. There were photographers. Wicker stood at attention in his SS uniform, presented himself, and formally surrendered the Dachau concentration camp to the United States Army. He signed the papers. He stood straight. He had, by any military standard, done exactly what a commander in his position was supposed to do. He had assessed an impossible situation, protected his men from a pointless last stand, and surrendered with order and dignity. 3 hours later, he was dead. Not as part of the events in the coal yard. The geography of Dachau that day was large and chaotic, and different things were happening in different places simultaneously, and the exact circumstances of Wicker's death in the hours after the formal surrender were never fully reconstructed in the historical record. What is known is that he had surrendered. What is known is that the protection that surrender was supposed to guarantee did not hold in every corner of the camp that afternoon. The 45th Infantry Division had been fighting for 500 consecutive days. They had seen their friends die. They had crossed a continent, through smoke and cold and mud. And when they came, through the gates of Dachau, and saw what was inside, something broke that no training had prepared anyone to contain. 39 boxcars, 2,000 bodies, 12 years of organized, industrialized, meticulously documented murder conducted inside walls that were 12 miles from the city of Munich, while the world, more or less, looked elsewhere. The soldiers of the 45th had liberated other places. They had seen the aftermath of combat. They had passed through bombed cities and walked through fields where men had died badly. None of that was this. The smell reached them before they reached the gate. It was not the smell of the battlefield, which every one of them knew from hundreds of days of close acquaintance. This was older, heavier, the smell of something that had been sealed up and left to compound over years, that carried in it not just death, but the systematic nature of the death, the fact that it had happened not in a moment of violence, but as a policy sustained across a decade, maintained by bureaucracies and budgets and shift schedules and regular reporting up the chain of command. One soldier walked through the gate and stopped in the middle of the road and could not move. Another made it to the wall of a barracks before his body made the decision his mind hadn't reached yet. They were not weak men. They were among the most battle-hardened soldiers the United States Army had produced in 4 years of war. They simply had no category for this. Their understanding of what human beings did to other human beings had been formed by combat, sudden, bilateral, chaotic. What they were walking through was not that. It was the evidence of something patient and deliberate and permanent. What would a man do, walking through that evidence, and then turning a corner and finding, against a wall, the men who had administered it? That was the question no regulation covered. That was the question Felix Sparks had been carrying all his life, without knowing it, since the food lines in Miami, Arizona, since Anzio, since every moment he had been required to know the difference between what was right and what was simply the next thing in front of him. He would find the answer in the coal yard. And the answer, it turned out, was not simple at all. The orders came through at mid-morning. Sparks was moving his task force toward Munich when the radio crackled and the regimental commander's voice came through with new coordinates. Forget Munich. Turn the column. There was a camp 10 miles outside the city. Secure it. Post an airtight guard. Let no one in or out. Sparks relayed the order and the column turned. None of them knew what Dachau was. The name meant nothing. The words concentration camp had appeared in dispatches and newspaper reports for years, but the full dimensions of what those words contained had been deliberately obscured by the people running the places, and the stories that did filter through were so far outside the range of what a reasonable person could accept as true that most people, including most soldiers, had filed them in the category of wartime exaggeration. Lieutenant William Cowling, one of the officers moving toward the camp that morning, had said it plainly in a letter home. When he heard such stories back in the States, he never believed them. They believed them by noon. The boxcars were parked on the tracks outside the main complex, visible from the road, before the gate was even in sight. 39 of them. Standard German freight cars, the kind used to move cattle or coal or military supplies across the continent. They were sitting still in the April light, with their doors open. Sparks saw his lead soldiers stop. He came forward to see why. The smell arrived before the image resolved. Not gradual, immediate, total, the way a wall stops you when you walk into it in the dark. It was the smell of 2,000 bodies in various stages of decomposition, sealed in wooden cars in the early spring heat, some of them having been there for days. It was the smell of starvation and disease and the particular biology of mass death in an enclosed space, and it was unlike anything in the vocabulary of combat that any of them carried. One of his men turned to the side of the road. Another stood completely still, with his rifle at his side, and his eyes fixed on the nearest car, and said nothing, and did not move for a long time. Sparks looked at the cars. He made himself look, the way he had made himself do things throughout the war. Not because it was bearable, but because it was necessary, because someone had to see clearly, and he was the one responsible for what happened next. Brain matter was visible on the ground near one of the cars. A prisoner had been beaten to death close enough to the track that the evidence of it remained in the dirt. Inside the cars, through the open doors, the bodies were stacked, without arrangement, not laid out, not organized, but accumulated, the way debris accumulates in a drain, because there had been so many of them, and so little space, and the people putting them there had, at some point, stopped thinking of them as bodies and started thinking of them as a problem of volume and containment. He gave no order. There was no order that addressed this. He simply kept moving, and his soldiers followed him, because that was what they had learned to do over 500 days. Keep moving, keep moving, keep moving, as long as the man in front of you is still moving. They scaled the wall into the camp. The prisoner compound opened in front of them, and the scale of what was inside took another minute to process. 30,000 people. That was the number, though numbers do not carry the weight of the thing they describe. 30,000 people in a space built for far fewer, packed into wooden barracks that had become, over 12 years of continuous operation, something between a warehouse and a slow machine for the removal of everything a human being was. They came out, when the soldiers came, over the wall. Slowly at first, then faster, streaming from the barracks in their striped uniforms, pressing toward the inner wire fence that still separated them from the Americans. Some were walking. Some were not walking, but moving anyway, dragging themselves forward on limbs that had not had adequate nutrition in months or years. Some stood in place and made sounds that were not quite language, not screams, not words, something more fundamental, the sound of people whose bodies were expressing something the mind had not yet fully caught up to. Sparks moved through them. He passed the crematoria. The furnace doors were closed, but the smell was specific and unmistakable, different from the boxcars, closer and more recent. He did not open the doors. He had seen enough to know what was behind them, and he needed to keep moving, needed to stay functional, needed to remain the person his soldiers were looking at to understand what came next. He passed the medical experimentation block. The rooms were empty now, but the equipment remained, the kind of equipment that had no legitimate medical purpose, that existed solely to document what happened to a human body when it was subjected to extremes of cold, or pressure, or infection, or starvation under controlled conditions. There were records, careful, methodical records in the particular handwriting of people who considered themselves scientists. He passed the punishment cells, small concrete rooms where prisoners had been placed in darkness, without food or water, until they died, or confessed to something, or simply ceased to require further attention. He walked, and he looked, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and his soldiers walked behind him, and they said nothing either, and the silence between them was the silence of people who are watching their understanding of the world undergo a revision that will not be complete for years, possibly ever. A soldier named Felance, moving through a warehouse nearby, found thousands of corpses stacked inside like sacks of grain. He described it afterward in the flattest language he could find, because flat language was the only kind that didn't break. The sight and the smell made him vomit uncontrollably against the warehouse wall, and then he straightened up and kept moving, because there was nothing else to do. Some of Sparks's soldiers began to cry. He did not order them to stop. He had been commanding men long enough to know that there were moments when the professional apparatus of a soldier, the discipline, the training, the practice detachment, simply could not cover what was being asked of it, and that the right response was to let the machinery strain and hold rather than demand it perform, as though nothing unusual was happening. He did not cry himself. He was not built that way, or had built himself not to be that way. It was hard, by 1945, to distinguish between the two. What he felt, walking through Dachau, was something he would spend decades trying to describe and never quite manage. a kind of cold rearrangement of the interior, as though some assumption he had been carrying, without knowing it, about what the world fundamentally was, about the range of things that were possible in it, had been quietly removed and replaced with something heavier and more permanent. He saw the SS guards as he moved deeper into the complex. Not all of them. Most had fled in the days before the Americans arrived, taking with them the institutional knowledge of the place and leaving behind only the lowest-ranking men and the evidence of what had been done. But some remained, hands raised, standing in small groups, watching the Americans move through the camp with expressions that ranged from visible fear to a blankness that was, in some ways, harder to look at than the fear. He processed them, sent them under guard toward the collection points, kept moving. It was Lieutenant Walsh who organized the segregation. Walsh had come through the main gate with his company and encountered the boxcars and kept moving and entered the camp and begun, with the automatic efficiency of a soldier doing the next thing, to gather the SS men he found and separate them from the Wehrmacht personnel who had been stationed at the camp for non-SS duties. He was systematic about it. He had a soldier's instinct for process, for breaking a complex situation into manageable components and working through them in order. He separated the SS men from the others. He marched the SS men into the coal yard. The coal yard was a partially enclosed space on the interior of the camp, 3 walls of masonry about 10 feet high forming an L shape, an open area used for storage. Walsh lined 50 to 60 SS men against the back wall. He posted a machine gun team. He organized his soldiers around the perimeter. Then something happened that no order had authorized and no training had anticipated. Walsh looked at the men against the wall. He looked at the camp behind him, the barracks, the crematoria, the warehouses, the boxcars still visible. Through the gate, 2,000 dead in 39 cars on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and something in the circuitry of a man who had been fighting for 500 days and had just spent an hour walking through the systematic evidence of 12 years of industrial murder made a connection that the regulations did not cover and the Geneva Convention had not been designed to address. He gave the order. The machine gun opened up. Sparks was 40 yards away when he heard it. He came around the corner of the wall and found Curtin behind the gun, crying and still firing, and 12 men down, and his soldiers standing in a ring watching it happen, and the smoke drifting up from the barrel into the late afternoon air and the smell of the camp all around them. That thick, insistent smell that had been present since the road outside, that would be present in his clothes and his memory, in the middle of the night for years afterward. He pulled his .45. He aimed it at his own men. "Anyone fires another round," he said, "I will shoot them myself." The gun went silent. Curtin's hand came off the trigger. He was shaking badly. He was a 19-year-old boy from somewhere in America who had been given a weapon and sent to the far side of the world and had walked through a gate that afternoon and seen something that had broken, in the space of an hour, whatever mechanism he had been using to keep himself intact. Sparks looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the men on the ground. Some were dead. Some were still moving. The camp's medical officer, Lieutenant Howard Buechner, was nearby. Sparks ordered medical attention for the wounded. Buechner did not move toward them. Later, Buechner would be cited for dereliction of duty. The sun was going down behind the barracks buildings. The light was going amber and flat across the coal yard, catching the dust that had been raised and was settling slowly back to earth. From the prisoner compound, the sound of 30,000 people who had just understood that they were free was still coming in waves. A sound unlike anything Sparks had heard in 500 days of war, human voices doing something that was not quite cheering and not quite weeping, but contained elements of both, rising and falling in the still air of an April evening in Bavaria. Sparks stood in the coal yard, with his pistol in his hand, and that sound behind him, and 12 men in front of him on the ground. And he did not know, and would not know for the rest of his long life, which side of the wall he was really standing on. An hour after the coal yard went quiet, Sparks was moving through the prisoner compound when he stopped. There was nothing dramatic about the reason he stopped. No explosion, no order. A man in a striped uniform, one of the 30,000, indistinguishable from the others by any external measure except that he happened to be in Sparks's line of sight at that particular moment, was trying to help another man stand up. The second man could not stand. His legs had given out, or had been giving out for some time, and whatever remained of the muscle and coordination required to support a human body upright had been reduced, over months or years of systematic starvation, to something that no longer reliably functioned. He went down. The first man steadied him, repositioned his hands, tried again. The second man went down again. The first man did not stop. He tried again, and again, with a patience that had nothing performative about it. No audience, no expectation of success, just the simple insistence of one person refusing to accept that another person could not be helped. Sparks stood and watched. He had been moving constantly since before dawn. Moving was how he managed the war. Had always been, since Sicily, since the first time he understood that forward motion was the only reliable defense against the thing that happened to men who stopped and thought too long about where they were and what was happening around them. There was always a next position, a next objective, a next thing that needed doing, and as long as there was a next thing, the interior machinery could be kept running in the right direction. He stopped now. He watched the man try again. Watched him get the second man partially upright, hold him there, with arms that had no real strength left in them, find some other kind of strength from somewhere else, and hold. He stood there for longer than he could account for later. Then he kept moving. He did not tell anyone about that moment for a long time. It did not appear in his official account of the liberation. It was not the kind of detail that belonged in a military document. But it was the image that stayed, not the boxcars, not the crematoria, not the coal yard, with its particular geometry of consequence. That one man holding another man up, with arms that had nothing left, in a compound where the entire architecture of the surrounding world had been designed to make exactly that gesture impossible. He filed it somewhere he could not name, and kept walking. 3 days later, the investigation began. On May 2nd, Major General Arthur White, 7th Army Chief of Staff, issued the order, formal investigation of alleged mistreatment of German guards at the concentration camp at Dachau. The assignment went to Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker, a 41-year-old lawyer, from the Judge Advocate General's office. Whitaker arrived at Dachau the following morning, conducted a forensic examination of the coal yard, counting shell casings, measuring distances, photographing positions, and began taking sworn statements from the soldiers who had been present. The statements were, by and large, characterized by poor recall of specific details. Some men remembered things differently from other men. Some men remembered the same sequence of events in an order that contradicted the physical evidence. Some men used language that accounted for the deaths of the SS prisoners in terms of combat response, attempted escape, threatening gestures, formulations that the shell casing positions and the photographs of men lying against the back wall, with their hands still raised, did not entirely support. Sparks did not do that. He wrote his account as accurately as he could reconstruct it. He described what he had seen when he returned to the coal yard. He described Curtin behind the gun. He described the order he gave. He described looking at the wounded men on the ground and ordering medical attention. He did not fabricate a tactical justification. He did not claim the Germans had rushed the wire or reached for weapons or done anything that would have made what happened legally defensible. He wrote what happened. It was the same stubbornness that had made him a difficult officer in peacetime and a reliable one in combat. The inability to perform a version of events that he did not believe was true, even when the true version was the one most likely to damage him. Whitaker's completed report identified 28 killings that constituted potential violations of international law. For men shot in a boxcar, 17 in the coal yard, 7 near the guard tower. He had a viable case, he believed, against Lieutenant Walsh, Private Pruitt, Lieutenant Bushyhead, and others. He recommended courts-martial. The recommendation moved up the chain. Sparks was relieved of his command while the process played out. The 157th kept moving. The war in Europe had less than 2 weeks left in it, and Sparks was separated from the men he had led for 500 days and placed in the administrative purgatory of a pending investigation, which is a particular kind of punishment for a man whose entire identity had been organized around being present, being responsible, being the person who stayed. Lieutenant General Wade Hayslip reviewed Whitaker's findings and pushed back. Prosecuting these men, he argued, ignored the psychological reality of what they had encountered at Dachau, the accumulated weight of 500 days of combat, the specific and unprecedented horror of what was behind that gate, the distinction between men who commit war crimes from indifference or ideology and men who commit them because something in them broke in the face of evidence. That 12 years of industrial murder had been conducted 12 miles from a major European city, without the world doing anything substantial to stop it. He used the phrase temporary insanity. It was a legal term. Under military law, a soldier was not responsible for his actions if he suffered from a mental condition that impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong. Hayslip was arguing that what the men of the 45th had seen that afternoon at Dachau met that threshold, that the coal yard was not the act of soldiers who didn't know better, but of soldiers who knew exactly what they were doing and found, in that moment, that knowing better was not enough. The paperwork moved upward. It reached George S. Patton. Patton had been appointed military governor of Bavaria 2 weeks earlier. It was a posting that fit him poorly, and he knew it. He was a battlefield commander being asked to perform the functions of an administrator, to navigate the politics of occupation and denazification while the war he had been built for was grinding to its close without him. He was restless and opinionated and already beginning to say things in press conferences that were making Eisenhower uncomfortable. But on the question of the Dachau investigation, he was decisive. Sparks was summoned to his office. The office was in a requisition building in Bavaria, a German bureaucrat's room now occupied by an American general with a heavy desk and the kind of institutional furniture that looks the same in every country and every era. Patton was behind the desk when Sparks entered. The investigation file was in front of him, Whitaker's report, the sworn statements, the photographs of the coal yard, the legal memoranda recommending prosecution. Patton looked at Sparks. He did not ask him to explain himself. He did not deliver a speech about the law, or the rules of war, or the importance of maintaining moral standards that distinguished the Allies from the enemy. He was not that kind of general in private. In private, he was direct in the way that men are direct when they have run out of patience for the performance of deliberation. He looked at the file. He looked at Sparks. He said, "I have already had these charges investigated, and they are a bunch of crap." He picked up the papers. He tore them. Not a symbolic partial tear. He tore them fully, the way you tear something you have decided has no further use, and dropped the pieces into the wastebasket beside the desk. "I'm going to tear up these goddamn papers on you and your men," he said. Then, after a pause that Sparks would remember for the rest of his life, "You have been a damn fine soldier. Now go home." He did not explain his reasoning. He did not cite the extenuating circumstances or the temporary insanity doctrine or the moral complexity of prosecuting men for acts committed in the shadow of industrial genocide. He did not perform the calculus out loud. He made a decision with the same directness he had applied to every decision in the war, quickly, completely, without visible doubt, and then it was done. Sparks did not thank him. There was nothing in the room that felt like a moment requiring thanks. Patton had not done him a favor in the transactional sense. He had made a judgment about the men, about the day, about what the law was designed to protect, and whether this particular application of it served that purpose, and had acted on it, and now it was over. Sparks stood, acknowledged the dismissal, and walked out. The hallway outside was empty. He stood there for a moment. Through the building's windows, the Bavarian afternoon was doing what Bavarian afternoons do in late spring, the light going long and golden across farmland that looked, from this distance, entirely indifferent to the fact that the world had just spent 6 years destroying itself in every direction. He thought about his soldiers, about Curtin, 19 years old, and what he would carry home, about Walsh, who had given the order and would never, in 50 more years of living, express anything resembling regret about it, who would say, in a 1990 interview, that he didn't think there was any SS man killed at Dachau who couldn't figure out why. About the men against the wall in the coal yard, some of whom had been at Dachau for years, and some of whom had arrived in the final weeks, and some of whom, like Wicker, had stayed when they could have run, and had done what the rules required, and had died anyway in a day that had stopped following the rules hours before. He thought about the man in the striped uniform, the one who kept trying to hold the other man up. He thought about going home. He had been telling himself, for 500 days, that home was the destination, the fixed point that gave direction to everything else, the place where the accumulated weight of the war could be set down and left. Now it was within reach, and he found that he could not quite picture it. The man who had left Miami, Arizona in 1935, with nothing but the clothes he was wearing and the determination not to look back at the end of the road, was not the same man standing in a hallway in Bavaria in May 1945, and home, whatever it turned out to be, was going to have to accommodate someone the departure had not included. He walked out of the building. He went to find his men. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended on a Tuesday, with signatures on documents in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, and then again the following day in Berlin to satisfy the Soviets. And then it was over 6 years and 1 day after it began, with somewhere between 70 and 85 million people dead, a number so large that the human mind declines to process it as anything other than an abstraction, which is perhaps the mind's only reasonable defense against what the number actually contains. Felix Sparks went home. He enrolled in the University of Colorado Law School in the fall of 1945. He studied in the mornings and worked in the afternoons and did the things that men who have come back from wars do when they are trying to build something in the space where the war used to be. He graduated in 1948. He passed the bar. He opened a practice in Delta, Colorado, a small town in the western part of the state, cattle country, the kind of place where people knew each other's names and the pace of life moved at a rate that bore no resemblance to anything he had experienced since Miami, Arizona, in 1935. He became a district attorney, then a justice of the Colorado Supreme Court, then the director of the Colorado Water Conservation Board, a position he held for decades, working on the unglamorous and essential work of managing water rights in a dry state, attending meetings and reviewing documents, and doing the patient, incremental work of public administration that leaves no monuments and requires no courage of the battlefield variety. He married. He raised a family. He stayed in the Army Reserve and eventually rose to brigadier general in the Colorado National Guard. He helped reorganize the 157th Infantry Association and organized reunion trips to the battlefields where the regiment had fought: Sicily, Anzio, southern France, Germany, taking the men who were still living back to the places where other men had not been. He did not talk much about Dachau, not because he was ashamed, not because the memory had faded, because he had found, over the years, that most conversations about that day moved too quickly toward conclusions, toward verdicts and moral positions, and the particular human need to resolve difficult things into something manageable, and the day itself resisted that. It was not a story with a clean lesson. It was a day that sat in the record unresolved, the way certain facts sit in the record, demanding to be looked at, without the comfort of a frame that makes them easier to hold. He kept the 157th alive. He organized the reunions. He showed up. That was what he could do, and he did it. William Curtin went home. He was 19 years old when he was behind the machine gun in the coal yard, and the investigation that followed the liberation of Dachau took his sworn statement and recorded his name and placed him in the file that Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker compiled over the course of May 1945 and completed on June 8 of that year. The file recommended courts-martial. The recommendation moved up the chain. Patton tore up the papers. Curtin was never charged. He went back to wherever in America he had come from. The record does not foreground him, does not follow him into the life he built after the war, does not document whether he dreamed about the coal yard, or whether he found a way to set it down, or whether the setting down was itself a thing that had to be done repeatedly, over years, without ever quite being finished. He is a name in a declassified file. He is a 19-year-old boy behind a machine gun on an April afternoon in Bavaria, crying and firing, and then stopping when a man he trusted told him to stop. What he carried home is not in the record. Lieutenant Walsh went home too. He was less private about it. In a 1990 interview, 45 years after Dachau, he said what he thought, with the directness of a man who had decided, at some point, that the time for equivocation was behind him. He said he didn't think there was any SS man shot or killed at Dachau who couldn't figure out why. He said that, when he got to hell, he would check it out and find out if he was right. He offered no apologies. He was not, by any conventional measure, a brutal man. He was a soldier who had walked through a gate and seen 12 years of evidence and made a decision in the space between one breath and the next that he was prepared to live with. Whether that preparation was wisdom or the absence of something, some interior mechanism that keeps the accounting open, is not a question the record answers. Heinrich Wicker does not appear in the post-war record at all. He was 25 years old when he carried the white flag to the gate of Dachau and surrendered the camp to the United States Army in the presence of journalists and a brigadier general. He signed the papers. He stood straight. He did what the rules of war required of a commander in an untenable position. He was dead by evening, in circumstances that the chaos of that afternoon made impossible to fully reconstruct, and no court ever convened to examine what happened to him, and no history has centered him as its subject, and he is present in the record mainly as a name in the formal surrender documents. The man who handed over the keys to a place he had not built and could not have dismantled, and was left to answer for in the only way the day made available. He was not among the architects of Dachau. He was among those who were there at the end. The difference between those two things did not save him. In 1987, the United States government declassified the Whitaker investigation file. It had been sealed for 42 years. 200 pages. Sworn statements from nearly 24 soldiers. Forensic examination of the coal yard. Photographs. Legal memoranda. The complete record of what Joseph Whitaker had found when he arrived at Dachau on May 3, 1945, and began asking questions. For 42 years it had sat in the National Archives in Washington, inaccessible, while the men whose names were in it lived their lives, became lawyers and district attorneys, and justices and water board directors, and fathers and grandfathers, carrying the private weight of a day that the official record had decided, for reasons of institutional complexity and moral ambiguity, not to adjudicate. In 1992, Felix Sparks, 75 years old, retired from the bench and from the National Guard, living in Colorado, received a copy. He sat down and read it. He read his own sworn statement, written in May 1945 in the careful language of a man who had decided to tell the truth and was doing so with the precision of someone who understood what precision cost. He read Whitaker's findings. He read the legal conclusions of Colonel Decker, who had written, in late 1945, that in light of the conditions which greeted the eyes of the first combat troops, it was not believed that justice or equity demanded the difficult and perhaps impossible task of fixing individual responsibility. He read the names of his soldiers. He read the numbers. He set the file down on the table in front of him. The window of his house in Colorado looked out on the western slope of the Rockies, a landscape of distance and altitude and the particular silence of high country, as far from a coal yard in Bavaria as geography could arrange. The afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in the mountains, moving across the ridgelines in slow patterns that had nothing to do with history or war or the question of what a man owed to the truth about himself. He sat there for a while. He did not reach a verdict. He had spent 47 years not reaching a verdict, and the 200 pages on the table did not change that, because the question was not one that evidence resolved. The question was the same one he had been carrying since the hallway outside Patton's office, since the coal yard, since the moment he heard the machine gun and turned and ran back toward it. Not away from it, toward it, because that was what he did, had always done, the thing that had cost him everything, from Anzio to the military police chasing him across an Italian airfield. He closed the file. Felix Sparks died on September 25, 2007, at St. Anthony Central Hospital in Denver, Colorado. He was 90 years old. He had been a soldier, a lawyer, a district attorney, a Supreme Court justice, a general, a water commissioner, a husband, and a father. He had spent 62 years living the life that Dachau had made possible, not by transforming him into something lesser, but by showing him, in the most extreme possible terms, what the line was and what it cost to hold it. The 157th Infantry Association, which he had helped keep alive for decades, marked his passing. The coal yard at Dachau is still there. It is a quieter place now. The camp has been a memorial since 1965, and the visitors who walk through it come in the manner of people paying a debt they did not personally incur. Careful, deliberate, reading the plaques and looking at the photographs and trying, in the way that people try at such places, to let the scale of it arrive in full rather than at the manageable distance that self-protection requires. The coal yard does not have a plaque about what happened there on April 29, 1945. What happened there is part of the larger record, documented, analyzed, argued over by historians, who have reached different conclusions about what it means and what it should have cost and what it says about the nature of justice and its limits. What is not argued over is this: one man came back. When the gun opened up, one man ran toward it. He aimed his pistol at his own soldiers and told them to stop, and they stopped. And then he stood in the coal yard in the late afternoon light of an April Tuesday, with the smell of 12 years of industrial murder all around him, and the sound of 30,000 people who had just understood they were free coming in waves from the direction of the prisoner compound. And he did not know, could not know, would not know for the rest of his long life, whether he had saved the men on the ground or saved his own soldiers from themselves or saved something less concrete and more essential that does not have a clean name in any language. He ran back. That is what the record shows. In a day when everything was being decided in the dark, in the space between 1 second and the next, without the possibility of deliberation or the comfort of a frame that makes difficult things easier to hold. Felix Sparks heard the gun and ran back toward it. The question he never answered, the one that sits at the center of this story the way certain questions sit at the center of every story about what human beings do to each other and for each other when the structures that normally hold everything in place have given way, was whether he knew, in those 3 seconds before he came around the wall, what he was going to find, and whether knowing would have changed anything. That question does not belong to 1945. It belongs to anyone who has ever stood at the edge of something they could not stop and had to decide, in less time than it takes to name the decision, which direction to move. Where would you have run if this story stayed with you? Leave your answer in the comments below. Every comment is one more time this story gets told to someone who hasn't heard it. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this one, the real human moments of World War II, on both sides of the wire, in the places history doesn't always go, subscribe to WW2 Untold Vault. We don't tell history. We tell the people inside it.